It's been more than 4 decades since the tangled affair known as Watergate. The scandal helped define a generation and also led to changes in how the White House operates, managing scandals, and conducts federal investigations. It was 45 years ago this week, the events that ultimately took down a president.
At first, it was called the Watergate caper. 5 men apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington.
Those men were ultimately found to be connected to the Nixon White House.
Mr. Gonzalez, how were you treated in jail?
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Nixon denied it.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities.
But through investigative reporting, congressional inquiries,
I was aware of listening devices,
and the appointment of a special prosecutor, it was finally determined he was lying.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
President Nixon, the 37th president of the United States, left the White House on August 9th, 1974.
We'll see you again.
The first, and so far the only president to be forced out of office in scandal. And 60 Minutes correspondent Lesley Stahl was one of the journalists with a front row seat to that White House scandal. You were sort of a young pup. A young reporter.
I was a rookie.
So you're at the sort of like the bottom of the barrel in terms of reporters.
Absolutely.
And you get assigned to this.
Well, because nobody thought it was a big deal in the beginning. And in fact, Ron Ziegler, the president's press secretary, used to call it a third-rate burglary. Why are you getting all excited about it?
Right.
And in fact, no one was excited about it in the beginning. No one believed that the president was involved.
So you go to the courthouse to cover this third-rate burglary.
And the Senate. There were courthouse trials.
Right.
There was Senate hearings. It was enormous.
And at what point did you realize, oh, this is so much more than a third-rate burglary?
Well, there was the 72 re-election campaign going on for Nixon, and everybody I knew was covering that. Very few of us. In the early courtrooms, there was one other reporter, me, Bob Woodward. I think it was after the campaign, after the election. Yeah. So there was June to November, just simmering under the radar. Yeah. And then the Democrats sued because, of course, the break-in was of their headquarters. And then it became a political story and something to actually cover, and then it began to take off.
And so you kept on the story. They kept you on the story.
Well, and both.
Did you have to fight to stay on that story?
Well, I was number 2 when it became big. I wasn't number 1 anymore. And they always need a number 2.
Right.
But the story built, and both in the courtrooms and in the hearings, they both had this strategy of going up the ladder, starting with the lower rungs, and then every interview with the witnesses was always, there's a higher up here. There's a, who is your boss? There's a higher up. And it kept climbing until there was one man left at the very top, and that was the president.
And that was the president. What sort of strategies did Nixon use as the temperature was rising, as they were moving up the ladder to the tippy top?
Well, everyone will recognize this strategy, blame the messenger. So a huge attack on the press. There's a familiarity in the air right now about that.
Yeah.
And a lot of stonewalling. We heard some words we're hearing now, like executive privilege. The president invoking a privilege that his aides cannot testify about anything involving him. He tried that strategy. Many others, until we learned of the tapes, I don't think I or anybody really was sure that Nixon was going to be caught up in this personally.
I think
he was protected. He was like the queen bee, and everyone else around him, and a lot of the Republicans, most of the Republicans, did everything they could to insulate him.
Lesley, it feels like you could swap one name out for another, almost, when you consider sort of the current conversation. And when you talk about strategies, one of the other strategies that I'm thinking about is blaming the media, which also happened. Could I play a little bit of sound for you?
Sure.
Okay, we want to play sound from Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler. Have a listen.
I read the other day where Mr. Bradley was giving a speech, and he said that the Nixon administration is committed to our destruction, referring to the press. That this administration is committed to the destruction of the free press. There's been nothing, as long as I've been press secretary, where we have ever involved ourselves in a program of destruction of the free press. We respect the free press. I respect the free press.
So you hear that 45 years later.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Bradley was Ben Bradley, who was Woodward and Bernstein's boss at the Washington Post. He was giving a little poke there to the Washington Post. I remember, I probably couldn't give you any specific, quotes from the president or people around him, but I remember feeling that we were targets. And in fact, the president had an enemies list that was discovered. And it was filled with people in the press.
The former director of national intelligence, James Clapper, he said that Watergate pales in comparison to what he's seeing now. What do you make of that statement?
You know, I hesitate to continue to draw too many parallels because I'm not sure what's happening here. I'm not. Mr. Clapper has a wider view and a deeper view. And so while we hear executive privilege and obstruction of justice and all the same words, I think journalists should be very careful. The president, Nixon, and he did try to subvert the CIA, and we knew it. It came out. He was involved in a cover-up. There was no question about it. And I don't think that Nixon would have had to resigned if there weren't tapes. And the public heard his voice. And they called it a smoking gun because up to that point, there was a real strong possibility he would survive. But those tapes were so incriminating about real serious wrongdoing, major wrongdoing, involving campaign cash coming in illegally to the administration and all kinds of things like that. I don't know exactly. I don't know what's happening now.
Right, but it certainly explains when we hear the word tape, we get a little antsy when a president tweets out anything about a possibility of a tape.
And you wonder why he did, Mr. Trump.
You certainly
wonder why
do.
He threw that in there.
Yeah. Watergate changed a lot in terms of how the White House deals with things, changed rules. What were some of the significant shifts that happened because of Watergate?
Well, there was campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
And there has been ever since an effort to dilute it, and it has been diluted.
Yeah.
They had the special prosecutor law that went into effect, and then that was undone. I guess it had to be renewed, and it wasn't renewed. One of the biggest changes is how the press responded to a president. Before that, presidents were given an enormous amount of slack by the press. There was more collegiality, and from Watergate on, there's just suspicion and an urge to do the job that we're supposed to do, and that is dig, cleanse out any corruption we find, and I think the press is more diligent about that.
Yeah, it certainly seems like that is what's happening now. I'm curious about your take on the American psyche at the time, though. Then versus now, how did people feel about Nixon? I know in hindsight, as you read the history books and we've sort of come to a conclusion about who and what he was, but how were people feeling about him then as this was slowly unfolding? Well,
there's something similar going on in terms of who is behind the president 100%, as if you're on his team, a football team or something.
Yeah.
You stay with no matter what that team does. They could have a losing season, they're still your team. And there was a huge, gigantic amount of people, maybe more than 50%, the people who voted for Nixon, stayed with him. And the others loathed him, despised him, and everything he did sounded illegal to them. So when people talk about the polarization and say it's never been worse, I actually do think it was worse back then. And of course, we had the Vietnam War on top of it. And Nixon really said he was going to end it, and it didn't end. So, I mean, there was clashing. There was violence sometimes in the streets.
That is so interesting. So interesting that you say the polarization is as bad or perhaps even worse in the
Maybe
past.
worse.
We tend to romanticize things sometimes. Lesley Stahl, thank you so much.
Pleasure.